Welcome back to A Fine Time for Healing, a place where your physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being are all that matter. So put your feet up, relax, and enjoy today's show. And as a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to the Randi Fine YouTube channel, please do it right now. And if you like a video, give me a thumbs up. Leave me comments so I know that what you like, what you don't like. And I just want to hear what you have to say about the shows that I do. Today I have an extraordinary show for you. Today we're going to be talking about borderline personality disorder with a leading expert. The leading expert is Jerold J. Kreisman. Is it Kreisman?
Yeah.
Okay, MD, who is a psychiatrist and leading expert on borderline personality disorder. He is co-author of the bestseller, I Hate You, Don't Leave Me, which is considered a classic of both the popular and academic literature on BPD and has been completely revised and updated in 2010. His book, Sometimes I Act Crazy, describes how families and friends confront the disorder. Dr. Kreisman produces a blog for Psychology Today. He lectures widely in the US and abroad and is in private practice in St. Louis, Missouri. Welcome, Dr. Kreisman. Great to have you.
Thank you.
Okay. What is borderline personality disorder?
Well, borderline personality disorder is one of the 10 defined personality disorders that are generally accepted, including such things as obsessive compulsive personality, paranoid personality. BPD is one of the most diagnosed. It's that of those 10, defined by a number of criteria that involve elements of tendencies to see the world in extremes of black and white, right or wrong, good or bad, characterized by tremendous mood swings depending on what is in their environment. They are happy walking from the kitchen to the dining room, and if somebody says something that upsets them, they become depressed, maybe even suicidal. They can be self-sabotaging frequently with impulsive behaviors, sometimes cutting on themselves, hurting themselves in ways like that. They have frantic fears of abandonment, feelings of emptiness, an unstable sense of identity, tending not to know exactly what they're looking for. They are a Democrat when they're with Democrats, or Republican when they're with Republicans, but at 3 o'clock in the morning and when no one else is around, they're not sure what they believe in. All of those things lend themselves to having really turbulent interpersonal relationships, and a sense of self that is so adjustable. They can be a chameleon. They can sort of fit in everywhere, but at the same time have a sense of emptiness.
Okay. Sounds pretty awful to have that disorder. And I know that it's awful for people who are dealing with it, in a relationship or family, but it sounds like it's particularly awful to have.
It really is a challenge. At the same time, it's probably among the most stigmatized of illnesses, in the sense of, ask most any psychiatrist or psychologist, what is the diagnosis in a person walking in your office that you really don't want? They won't say schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or alcoholism. They'll say, oh, don't give me another patient with borderline personality disorder. But at the same time, these can be exciting, artistic, successful, intriguing, and fun people as well. They're just dealing with challenges that are part of their lives, sometimes related to traumas earlier in their life.
Right. And so this is something that develops in childhood?
It's usually recognized by adolescence, where these extremes come out. Of course, when you talk about issues of identity and impulsivity, you can think of the term borderline adolescent as kind of a redundancy. because all adolescents struggle with that to some degree. But we're talking about extremes of that. And it generally is recognized in the mid-20s as the most common time. It's usually associated with other disorders. It usually doesn't stand alone. It's frequently associated with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, sometimes eating disorders, ADHD. Some of the symptoms overlap, and they can sort of camouflage each other too.
And it's a cluster B disorder in the DSM-5. So it's in the same category as antisocial and narcissistic and histrionic, right?
That's correct. They're all kind of related to emotional kind of ways of responding.
Right. But borderline is a lot different than narcissistic personality disorder. And I think one of the things I should say that makes it very difficult to deal with is that this person is able to demonstrate love and affection, but then they take it away. And so people really have a hard time understanding, do they love me? Do they not love me? And they get stuck in the fluctuating moods. They get caught up in being driven by those fluctuating moods, right?
Yeah, I think so. In many ways, there is a complementary capacity in both. I mean, typically in a narcissistic personality, there's a lack of real sensitivity and empathy, whereas typically in a stereotype person with stereotypical borderline symptoms, there's an excess of emotions and sensitivity. Someone with BPD can read people very well, sometimes being overly sensitive to some of the factors they see.
You know, in the last 5 years or so, as I've learned more about BPD, I've come to understand that one of my family members has it. And it explains so much, because this is a person who I could be very close with, and then all of a sudden would tell me that I'm the enemy and I'm working against her, and it would come out of nowhere. I would get these phone calls that start accusing me of being the enemy when in fact we were very close. And so but this person was also very successful, very artistic, very musical, those kind of things, very successful and very likable to those who didn't have to experience these mood shifts. But anyone that was close to her had a very difficult time. And so we both grew up in a home with a narcissistic mother. Can that be something that can kick this disorder off?
Yeah, I think frequently there is a history of difficulty with connection, with attachment, and not infrequent, not always, but a not infrequent background. In addition to a history of abuse, but even absent that, there's not infrequently a history of a mothering figure who is either narcissistic, detached, uninvolved, where there isn't a real connection with human beings or a sense of what emotions are reasonable and workable as a child grows, or the opposite, a clinging mothering figure that doesn't allow the child to separate and individuate and just sort of maintains a clinging dependency that makes it also difficult to begin dealing with interpersonal relationships in the world.
What are the subconscious mechanisms, if you can, in layman's terms, that cause a child to begin to develop this way? NPD is kind of a maladaptive coping mechanism on steroids. I mean, it's pretty much, when they make that decision, that's pretty much it. Okay. How does borderline develop?
Probably the primary underlying dynamic is what's referred to as splitting.
Okay.
In childhood, we're used to black and white kind of things. Fairy tales are set up that way. They're the good guys and the bad guys.
Right.
We don't deal, children can't deal with nuances. The childhood fairy tales don't talk about the evil queen who maybe had a rough childhood and maybe we need to understand her more, or why is Snow White sleeping around with the seven little people, and the differences. There are no grays. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and they're split. There's a good and the bad. And what seems to happen primarily in borderline personality is that childhood view of the world doesn't mature into beginning to see the gray, that there remains that way. And in the view of someone with typical borderline characteristics, people are seen as the good Joe and the bad Joe. There's a good person and a bad person. And when things are fine, they're not just good, they're great. People with borderline personality love beyond measure those who they will come to revile without reason at some point. Because once that good Joe does something disappointed, it isn't understood within that context. Suddenly he reverts to bad Joe. And it's very hard to bring those different perceptions together, to see that good people have flaws and flawed people may have good intentions. It's one or the other. And that splitting results in a tendency to devalue people or idealize them in ways that become unreasonable.
I can really relate to being on the receiving end of that, and feeling like the judgment was extreme and unfair and irrational, and there was nothing I could say to change it. It just switched, and that's what it was. It was very, very difficult to be on the receiving end of that. So what are some of the behaviors that somebody may recognize that may indicate borderline personality disorder?
I think the inconsistency that we've been kind of referring to, the tendency to see things as sort of overly wonderful, and then negative, and a tendency to find those moods dependent on where they are. I mean that's a difference between say the mood swings you see in borderline personality and the mood swings you see in, say, bipolar disorder, which are usually more extensive, which may or may not be related to the environment. In borderline personality, things are wonderful and they can become suicidal just on the basis out of proportion to what the stimulants are. A tendency for inappropriate anger. You may say something kind of mildly negative and get a result that seems way out of proportion in terms of rageful outbursts. I think seeing those kinds of changes there, I think the typical kind of thing is a sort of what you see in the crazy ex-girlfriend kind of thing. The person who was, I'm saying girlfriend because although BPD is really prevalence 50-50 among men and women, those diagnosed are usually women. Well, 75% of those diagnosed are women, so it tends to be more female. So it was sort of that really fun girlfriend you had in college who was a lot of fun and very smart and very artistic and great to be with, but got a little nutty at times in terms of just being extremes of things. Everything was taken to the nth percent.
Okay. Are people with this disorder controlling and manipulative?
I think because of the frantic fear of abandonment, they can be very clingy and very manipulative. And again, a stereotype, and these are stereotypes. This is, there's a long range of health, and some are healthier in that range, and some more impaired. But I think, for example, a tendency to threaten suicide or threaten, if you leave me, I don't know what I'll do kind of thing can be very manipulative.
I've noticed, I kind of labeled it in, with my very limited amount of knowledge on this, as sort of a push-pull relationship. You know, sometimes they're full in, sometimes they push you away. It's like, it's really, you just don't know where you stand in these relationships. Can a person who has been sort of emotionally ousted through this splitting black and white thinking, can they redeem themselves? Can they find a way back to being liked again or trusted?
Oh, yes. I think you're talking about the push-pull is a good way of putting it, because they're really dealing with contradictory fears. On the one hand, there is this desperate fear of being abandoned. So there's a tendency to cling, but there's also a desperate fear of being overwhelmed, controlled, losing any primitive sense of identity that they have, because that's something they're trying to establish. So there is this sense of like, please don't leave me, please don't leave me. But then, oh my God, you're trying to control me, which is why it becomes a real conflagration when someone with narcissistic personality hooks up with somebody with borderline personality, because you see the real push pull. But what I think has been established very well in the last decade or more is that most people with BPD get better, with or without treatment. There tends to be a maturing out of a lot of the impulsivities, a lot of the self-destructive behavior. That begins, at least for the higher functioning people, a better realization of how their life is becoming chaotic. It isn't the rest of the world, it's really their behaviors. And they can begin with a maturing process, such that the vast majority, more than 90% over a lifetime, really lose the defining symptoms, that the defining criteria that define borderline personality.
Are they triggered by say, a parent who contributed to the development of this?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Say that again.
Okay, so somebody, an adult who has borderline, can they be triggered into switching, sort of the splitting, by a parent who may have been sort of responsible for the development of it? So in other words, if you have a parent who you felt abandoned or not seen or not heard or whatever, and then you go on and you live your life, but you have these brief times where you have to see this parent, can that trigger the splitting?
Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of sort of can bring things back. And in some cases, it can even result in a sort of a transient, almost quasi-psychotic experience. I mean, exposure to a great stress, like maybe being confronted with a trauma, maybe a person who traumatized this, say, in childhood or something, can sometimes lead to brief periods of dissociation where there's a sense that things aren't real, that they're not real, or a sense of paranoia, which for all the world can look like a full-blown psychosis, but it's transient, it's stress related, and once the stress is removed and things settle down, it disappears.
Really? Okay. That's really interesting. I had a client who had a psychotic episode out of nowhere, and claimed that he never had one. He was in his 40s, never had one before. And I thought, well, that's really odd. But now you're explaining this, so that's beginning to make a little more sense.
That certainly happens, and it's really mysterious when you see it, because, as I said, it looks for all the world like, oh my God, this suddenly you're having this psychotic break. This person, I missed this schizophrenia diagnosis, but they wake up the next morning and the stress is relieved and it's like gone.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I mean, my client began to hear voices and got very paranoid, and it scared me. And I said, you need to see a doctor. You need to see a psychiatrist. I'm not equipped to be helping you right now. But I didn't know what I was looking at. Of course, I'm not trained to know that. But this really explains that, because I was thinking, oh, come on, you have had, in your 40s, you must have had a psychotic break somewhere along the line, or you wouldn't just have one. But there was a very stressful situation, a very traumatic situation that kicked it off.
That can happen.
Okay, interesting. What about, I've read that people with BPD, sort of, they're the helpers, they're the Florence Nightingales of the world. They're the ones who want to, have this purpose of always being there, the first one there to help people when they're going through something. They have this charitable impulse, and I think it helps really to define their sense of self or give them a sense of self. What is your thoughts on that?
I think we do see that a lot. I think oftentimes part of it is to feel some sense of acceptance, of identity, of being needed, which is why it's not unusual to see people with BPD symptoms who are very much attracted to social work, to nursing, to helping professions as a way of kind of establishing a sense of identity and also feeling a connection of belonging.
So how are there like episodes that can happen like monthly or sort of a regular, like cyclical is what I want to say, or can it be kicked off by hormones like female hormones like the menstrual cycle or something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a vulnerability that can be triggered by, say, in women, pregnancy or menopausal changes, or drug use or drug exposure. There is kind of as with many medical illnesses, there in borderline personality, it's generally accepted that appears to be a genetic vulnerability, which, given environmental stresses, a person may be vulnerable to, some more vulnerable than other people. So it's a mixture of nature, nurture kind of things. And when other changes come in, that vulnerability gets expressed.
Could somebody appear to be more stable with their emotions and then just really have these episodes happen around the times of hormonal changes, women I'm speaking of, around hormonal changes, or would you see it in at other times?
Yeah, most people who would fulfill criteria to be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder appear perfectly normal on first meeting, and in many cases, very interesting people and attractive people to be with. But given the stresses from hormonal changes or other exposure, certainly things can then be expressed that lead to pathological behavior.
So I know with narcissistic personality disorder, there's a diagnostic criteria of 9 traits. Person only has to have 5 in order to be diagnosed with this personality disorder. What is the diagnostic criteria for borderline?
Well, currently it is the same. There are, as is true in much of medicine, other medical illnesses, but particularly in psychiatry, you have a number of criteria. In BPD, there are 9 criteria. One, in order to fulfill the diagnosis criteria, a person has to exhibit five or more of the 9, which is unfortunately a very artificial way of putting it, because that means if they have 5 criteria and they no longer are, say, cutting on themselves, then they only have 4 criteria, and boom, they're not borderline anymore. You either is or you isn't. And what we're seeing, and I think as things evolve in the next iteration of accepted definitions, we're going to see less of this categorical approach and more of a dimensional approach. There will be more a sense of degree of illness. There'll be a sense of more of how borderline-ish is this person in a sense, and judged more on a kind of a stereotype and how close one matches to the stereotype, which I think will be more helpful and less sort of stigmatizing.
So are you talking about like a spectrum or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. That, and indeed, that's what you usually see. Certainly, people who are identified with BPD are realistically on a very wide spectrum, many very high functioning, very successful in many areas, but for example, maybe really have difficulty with relationships, married and divorced several times, and can't find some stability there. And on the lower end, people who just really can't stay with a job, or really are unsuccessful in many endeavors.
So how is this treated? Because you feel like it is a treatable. I've read that, that's the one disorder where the psychiatrists and psychologists say no, thank you, because it's from what I've read, it's something that this person has to really commit to a long-term treatment of this, and because otherwise they will kind of lose what they've gained. So tell me what the truth is about.
Well, certainly that was the myth until maybe in the last 10 years or so, that these people never got better. It's useless. They're going to make you crazy if you're a therapist, and stay away. But really, over the last 10 and more years, there have developed a number of approaches. The primary approach, though, is psychotherapy, and there have been several that have been developed. There are medications that can be useful. Mostly they're treating the comorbid issues. If there's depression involved, or there's anxiety or ADHD involved, treating that, or alcoholism or substance abuse, you're treating that with a variety of things, including medicines that may be helpful. But some medicines also seem to help some of the impulsivities. High doses of typical antidepressants sometimes settle things down. Low doses of mood stabilizers, antipsychotic drugs even, tend to be somewhat helpful. But all that aside, the primary treatment approach is psychotherapy. And there have been several specific psychotherapies that have been developed primarily for borderline personality disorder, although they're also used in others. Probably the most studied is DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which is a form of intensive cognitive therapy, where in the classical model of it, one attends group therapy every week, individual therapy every week, that is mostly looking at skills training. Here's what you do when you're feeling angry. Here's what you do when you feel like you want to cut yourself. Here's what you do when your binging and purging is coming up and your impulses are getting out of control. Some cognitive behaviors. Another common approach has been what's called mentalization-based treatment, which is more a sort of a combination where there's encouragement and training in thinking through what's going on. I'm having this feeling. What is the other person? What is he doing that's stimulating my extreme emotions? And why are my emotions going up? Where you're sort of thinking through your behavior. Another form is what's called transference-focused therapy, which is more of a psychoanalytic individual therapy of usually a couple times a week, where you're really dealing with psychoanalytic, psychodynamic issues of how you're relating to different people, the transference. Schema therapy looks at past paradigms in one's life, is another form that's been developed that way. There's also been something that has really the benign but really useful term that's called good psychiatric management. Which is basically kind of combines a lot of these things. And it has to do a lot with first educating the person, telling them this is what you have. This is what we call it. These behaviors are what's called borderline personality. This is what you do when you have these stresses, you have difficulty with your sense of who you are. This is what we're going to talk about. And it's also used with individual group therapy. Family therapy can be involved too, if the family is not terribly, hopelessly unhealthy. So there are a variety of approaches. They all have been studied to some degree. They all seem to be successful. But there's also been studies that follow people who don't get any therapy, and many of them, usually it takes much longer, but many of them just get better too as time goes on.
So what I'm hearing you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's with this disorder, treating symptoms, awareness of symptoms, tools for coping with symptoms is the strategy rather than going into the core issues of what caused it?
There are really both.
Okay.
Certainly transference-focused therapy goes more into some of the past contributors. Schema therapy also goes more into past. Some of the cognitive behaviors, though, are less involved in kind of past traumas or past psychodynamic issues. And some sort of combine some of both.
Interesting. Is your practice largely seeing people with this disorder?
I'm not seeing as many anymore. But during the time that it was active, there was a fair amount. I mean, they roughly in outpatient psychiatry, statistics say it's about 10% of people have borderline. In inpatients, it's about 20%. For me personally, I saw a fair amount of that. I saw a lot with ADHD and the other kind of psychiatric illness. I had a fairly diverse practice, but yeah, there was a lot of focus on borderline.
Do these people, I'm asking this question because I've had many people come to me who were incorrectly diagnosed with having bipolar. Do a lot of these people get falsely diagnosed as having bipolar because of these mood swings?
Absolutely. Happens all the time. In fact, there was one study that demonstrated that for people that come to the accurate diagnosis of BPD, usually took about 4 or 5 years of erroneous diagnoses, partly because it wasn't really accepted for a long time, this diagnosis, and it's partly because it used to be, and it still is, a stigmatizing diagnosis. It's much nicer for a person to be called bipolar than it is to be called a dirty, rotten, no good borderline. Everybody's first wife was a borderline. It was always tended to be kind of a negative kind of thing. Whereas bipolar, you can't help it, but borderline, you're just being a nasty.
That's funny. And those who are diagnosed with bipolar are often put on something like lithium, which exacerbates the symptoms of the disorder that they actually have, or the sometimes we're talking about like abuse, the symptoms of abuse of what the person's dealing with. Lithium can really aggravate that and sort of make them have a harder time dealing with the issues. Is that you?
Well, actually, lithium sometimes is a mood stabilizer and sometimes can be helpful a little bit in borderline, but it's certainly true that when I would see patients, they would usually come with a whole load of drugs they've been on and have been on. And, when they were acting out, they'd get another antidepressant, another antipsychotic, another mood stabilizer, like Lamictal or lithium or Depakote or something else. And part of the thing is determining that they didn't need all those medicines, first of all, and then really kind of rectifying what really needed to be done. In some cases, like I said, medicines can be helpful. But I think that it is easier to sort of say, I have mood swings, okay, you're bipolar. There's a significant difference, but bipolar mood swings last longer, and they don't have this whipsaw effect, and there are other differences.
And that's why I feel like, these I don't understand these diagnoses because um, with bipolar disorder, you have prolonged times of depression and prolonged times of mania, and it's not like a roller coaster, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Right.
And you have periods of sort of stabilization in true bipolar disorder. Whereas again, like you said, the roller coaster is always there in borderline.
Hmm. Right. So I would imagine that somebody that was trained would be able to see the difference. But so that leads me to this question. What kind of training is there now for um, students who are majoring in this kind of, in psychiatry or psychology or whatever? Is there better training in regard to APD?
I think so. I think there. I can tell you when what prompted me to write my first book, the Hate You Don't Leave Me, was there really was we had developed in St. Louis a short-term treatment program specifically for borderline personality, which at that time for many of my colleagues wasn't accepted even as a diagnosis. It was just sort of kind of a thing you endowed on a patient you just didn't like, and there really was thought to be no treatment, nothing you could do with it.
Mm.
But most of the literature was in sort of psychoanalytic books, and people who came to our program said, "I want to read about this. I don't know anything about it," which is what prompted me to kind of try to put it um, uh, for not only for academics but also for the lay public. And I think over the years, there's been, so there really was, as I said, there were people who just didn't said, I don't believe in the diagnosis. And I think nowadays there is a greater appreciation, not only for the diagnosis, but the fact that it's more common than people thought too. Um, Depending on which study you want to believe, it certainly is as prevalent in our population, and maybe more so than, say, bipolar disorder, even though bipolar disorder research at the NIMH and federal endowments gets 20 times more funding than research on borderline personality or other personality disorders.
Hmm. Interesting. One thing that I know is that children who are exposed to hostile environments while they're growing up, there is a physiological change to the way their brain develops. The hippocampus, or there's a small. They've done studies. So people who have had all kinds of abuse in childhood do have emotional regulation issues in general, right?
Yes. And there have been studies that do show that the some of the connections in the brain are different in many patients that have been studied with bipolar disorder, especially in the formation of the brain. The earliest formation is in the center of our brains, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the areas that had to do with the most primitive life forms that were initially just reflexes and then became emotional kind of fight flight that animals have. And then eventually, as we developed over more and more layers, we finally get to what distinguishes human beings, the prefrontal cortex. That's the thinking part. And the connections between the deeper parts, the amygdala, the limbic system, which is the emotional system, and the prefrontal cortex, some of those connections are limited in borderline personality disorder, so that the fact that we have an emotion and then can't intellectually say, okay, wait a minute, I'm really angry at that guy. I'm not going to punch him in the face. I'm just going to walk away, or I'm going to confront him, or I'm going to do something else. That connection between the emotion you're feeling and the logic of our thinking brain, some of those connections are disrupted.
There's so many things. I mean, unfortunately, parents don't know how to always know how to raise children. There's so many things that can go wrong. that can cause us a lifetime of problems, and whether our parents intended or not, I mean, just a lot of arguments, constant arguing, which is how I grew up, always arguing, arguing. And I found it to be terrifying as a child. So that caused me issues, I know. So if someone is living with somebody with this personality disorder, is there a way they can help manage the frequency or duration of the episodes?
Yeah, I think there are a number of approaches. The last book I wrote, basically talking to people with borderline personality disorder, just sort of outlines just a whole variety of kind of styles. But I think it involves a combination of really being able to balance expressions of support for this person you care for, that you're committed to, a sense of empathy, of understanding. Empathy doesn't mean sympathy. You're not feeling sorry for them, but you're sort of, I understand why you get so angry at times. But also balancing those things with a sense of reality, a sense of truth that, when you yell and scream at me like that, it upsets me, and I'm going to walk out the door at those times. Just being able to develop some combination of those features to kind of be able to set boundaries, having some sort of boundaries in what you can do with that person, what you can do for that person, and where you have to put a boundary up and you have to relieve yourself from it.
So boundaries can be useful here.
I'm sorry, they can be.
Boundaries can be very useful.
They're going to be necessary in such situations, I think.
Right.
Otherwise, you could get swallowed up. And then if you do get swallowed up, then you lose a piece of yourself, and then you get angry and start to kind of lash out in ways that only reinforce all of the stuff. See, I knew you didn't love me. See, I knew you didn't care about me. See, I knew you were mad at me. I knew you all these things that I was accusing you of. Now you've just done that. One of the features of this is what's called projective identification, when you sort of project onto the other person things that you're really seeing in yourself. So for many people who interact with a borderline personality, they see examples of that when they sort of say, I'm not, when I sort of kind of keep taunting you until you lose your temper, then it becomes, see, you said I'm angry. I'm not angry. You're the one that's angry. And that sort of sucks a person in, which just reinforces the whole cycle.
That happens with narcissistic abuse as well.
Yeah.
They goad you into freaking out. They push your buttons and push your buttons and push your buttons until you blow. And then they say, see, you're the crazy one, not me.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not easy living with people like this. Why the word borderline is an odd kind of label for something like this. Where did that come from?
Back in, it was 1939, this a psychoanalyst was dealing with individuals, and basically back in the 1930s, individuals in psychiatry were separated into psychotic and neurotic patients. Psychotic being those who had lost connection with reality, and neurotic were the more anxious, depressed people who were amenable to psychoanalysis. And this Dr. Stern, who first coined the term, found that there were patients who were sort of on the borderline between these, because they appeared on the surface to be neurotic. But then when he put them on the couch, then sometimes they would devolve and they would become psychotic, and they would sort of couldn't handle that kind of looseness that is required in psychoanalytic treatment. So he sort of called them borderline. Mm. And people sort of picked that up, and then it lost it, and in the DSM-2, Back in the 50s, they were in the schizophrenia realm. They were called superneurotic schizophrenia or something like that. And then finally in the I guess in the 80s, when the DSM-3 came, it was finally reified as one of the personality disorders, and that sort of reinvigorated the term borderline again, even though in the international classification of diagnoses, which is very similar to our notorious DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, they have played with the term emotionally unstable personality disorder. But even that is split into impulsive and borderline. So borderline is sort of stuck around all these years, even though they're not really on the border of anything, really.
Right. It just stuck from the old diagnosis. Yeah, I mean, the DSM-5, there's a lot that's not in the DSM-5. Why is the American Psychiatric Association so slow to make changes or to embrace new concepts?
I think they feel a real burden to be very careful. I mean, as you know, it wasn't until the 70s that homosexuality was no longer deemed a pathology.
Wow.
And that took, so that's only been 50 years since that happened. Prior to that, that was considered psychopathological. So I think they go very slowly and very carefully, sometimes too much, and like anything else, I think they go in sort of styles. Up until the 50s, psychiatry was really controlled by psychoanalytic thinking, Freudian type thinking, and starting in the 60s. There was a push almost to the other extreme, that everything was that psychoanalysis was worthless and everything was biological and everything should be done to biological terms, which is why we got into the categories where you've got this syndrome, this syndrome, this syndrome, and this is what you got. And so now I think we're coming back a little bit towards the middle where we can appreciate that nature and nurture kind of go together. And there are biological determinants that are not inevitable, but are vulnerabilities. And there are situational things that have to do that are real things. And childhood is important, and it isn't to be ignored, as many thought in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
And biology is important, that you wouldn't convince the 1950s psychoanalyst.
Interesting. Yeah. Childhood is very important in people used to think, oh, you grow up and you get over it. That doesn't happen, and I'm glad that people are getting more open to embracing the child within, because it's so important in helping people to become the best version of themselves, to be able to understand what that child missed is still missing, really, right?
Yes.
Yeah. With NPD abuse, complex PTSD is very common because it's been years of trauma after trauma after trauma after trauma. And I know that the DSM-5 does not really recognize CTPSD. How do you feel about it?
I sort of go back and forth with it. It just seems sometimes it sort of confuses the situation a little bit. Genetically, there are, because there was a group of people some years ago that thought, well, really, as I said before, people have sort of denied the existence of borderline, that it's really a form of bipolar disorder was what some professionals thought. Others thought, no, it's really part of PTSD. And in genetic determinants, it determines that they're really different, that bipolar disorder does have certain genetic markers that are really different from borderline, and PTSD does as well. So I think it sort of confuses it a little bit, because some people, the symptoms of CPTSD, of complex PTSD, are basically the same as borderline personality. The difference is there's a trauma.
Oh,
And
wow.
although it's true that many people with borderline personality have a trauma that would fit as CPTSD, not all of them do.
Hmm.
So it sort of kind of
Hmm.
confuses in my mind a little bit.
That's interesting. So I know that people who have antisocial personality disorder, which that's the psychopathy and sociopathy, basically, they all have narcissistic personality disorder included in that, or as part of this disorder. They're all narcissists. It doesn't go the other way, and not all narcissists have antisocial, but I know that within that cluster B, that there's not always a clear distinction of one disorder versus another, because you can have aspects of all of them. And you even brought in some other disorders that are not in the cluster B, um, you know, grouping, so category. So can somebody with borderline have aspects of narcissism and histrionic or so forth and so on?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think when I mentioned that it rarely stands alone, it usually has another disorder. Sometimes another disorder might be another personality disorder. And that's, again, one of the difficulties with our categorical way of defining it. Well, let's see, he's got 5 of the 9 for borderline, and come to think of it, he's got 5 of the 9 for narcissism. So he's sort of both. It gets a little confusing. And there are certain biases too. I mean, I think if you take an individual who is, well, take a scenario. This person is in a bar, drinks too much, gets intoxicated, picks a fight with somebody, throws a few things around, starts cussing. They call the police, and the person gets a little rough and maybe then gets emotional and bursts out crying. If it's a woman, that if and a social worker came accompanying the police officer, they say, this is a borderline personality, we're going to take it to the emergency room. If it's a man, they're going to say he's an alcoholic and an antisocial personality, we're going to take him to jail. So
Wow.
there's this gender bias, I think, that goes on in how we tend to diagnose um, people as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I could definitely see that. So that's where this sort of spectrum theory is kind of making strides. Kind of
Yeah, I think
taking
so.
over
And I think
these
that's where we're going to be
the
heading.
labeling, right? The labeling, getting away from the labeling. And I think people do have problems with the label, and but I know that people who are exposed long term to those with these cluster B personality disorders um, have a particularly difficult time overcoming their own damage as a result of it. Does the same thing happen with when you're living with somebody with bipolar? Does it have the same effect as a personality disorder would have on someone who's experiencing that emotional abuse?
I think it can, particularly if you don't understand what it's about. Um, if the person is sort of in denial about what the symptoms are, if they don't really recognize what's going on, I think just like living with someone with substance abuse, where
Mm,
or alcohol, a tendency to not really see the extremes of what is happening. Um,
right. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So, how would someone who has listened to this and thinks, okay, well, that really describes the person that I'm living with, or the parent, or something like that, is there an approach to getting that person into help, getting help or therapy or?
I think yeah, if the designated patient is very resistant, I think it can be important for the other to get therapy. And from there, a lot of times you can glide into that saying, I'm going to see a therapist. And it would really be helpful if you came with me to see somebody so we can work on some of these things, because there may be a lot of projection on the other person saying, it's not me, it's you.
Yeah.
You push my buttons. That's why I get angry all the time. Um, so I think the other person needs to figure out a way to handle it, and a lot of times that can be a way to make an entree so that you can get both in to get in, and then that person sometimes can then see what they need to work on.
Do borderlines have the same reaction as narcissists do when, and I don't mean to, I know you don't like to identify them as borderlines, I'm just saying this, but people with this personality disorder, I should say, do they have the same extreme resistance and reaction to the diagnosis as somebody with NPD would have?
No, I think there's much more extremes with narcissistic personality, because the personality disorder itself is a cover for feelings, usually in the stereotype of feelings of insecurity and helplessness. And if that shield gets penetrated, that individual falls into a deep, deep depression that is so destructive. And so there's a desperate need to hold on to that shield in someone with NPD. Whereas BPD, there is more vulnerability, there is more sensitivity usually. There is more, usually a better insight to some degree, on average, I would say. So I think it's a lot harder penetrating that shield in NPD.
Mm-hmm. Do people feel a sense of relief when they understand why they've been going through this?
It's variable. What I can tell you is the established experts in the field generally recommend it's important to educate the individual to say, you have borderline personality disorder. Here's what it is. And you need to confront that. And for some people, that is a relief. All my life, I've had all these things I didn't know what it was. Now I have a name for it. And that's a relief. And that makes me feel better. But I think in some cases that I've seen, it becomes almost a badge, sort of saying, hey, you can't do that. I have borderline personality disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And so it becomes a shield of, it just explains it that I can go on and keep doing what I'm doing. So I quibble a little bit with other experts in the field who say you should always make it right above board and lay it on. I think in most cases that's true, but there are cases where I think they want to tread a little softly and let them come to it. Because and that I find is more helpful when the patient comes to me and says, I've been looking into things and I think I have symptoms of borderline personality disorder. Could that be? And then they can really begin to confront their behaviors themselves rather than being endowed upon them.
Good point. I was actually writing that as you were saying that, using their diagnosis as a out to continue the behavior, right? Yeah, I could see where that would happen. So, that's why people have to go to experts in these areas, because they can get really on the wrong track when they don't. So are you still practicing?
I don't see. I'm just consulting now. I'm not seeing individual patients now.
Okay, you're consulting on borderline, on the
Mostly,
topic of borderline. Okay,
yeah,
so you're
and still do some
speaking
writing and things there,
okay,
research and stuff. Yeah.
Interesting. And I know that you have 2 books. Tell us about the 2 books that you have.
Well, actually, a third book. I have one, Talking to a Loved One with Borderline Personality
Oh,
Disorder.
okay. Yeah, tell us about those.
Well, I think you mentioned the first 2. This one, the others have references and can be used academically as well. The third one, it was just basically for individuals in terms of basically what it says, talking to a loved one with borderline personality.
Oh, okay. And that's what it's called?
I'm sorry, what?
It's called Talking to a Loved One with Borderline Personality Disorder? Okay.
And just developing different, recognizing certain presentations of when your loved one has borderline personality and ways to deal with specific kinds of situations. I mean, so often you're confronted with a variety of confrontations, such as, the sort of damned if you do and damned if you don't kind of thing, where no matter what you say, you're going to be in trouble, and recognizing that you're in that position and how maybe to avoid that. Which dress makes me look fatter? Um, Whatever I say, oh, you think I'm fat? No, you don't think I'm fat. Oh, you're not being truthful. Oh, you think, and how you can kind of confront different dilemmas like that.
Is this largely responsible for divorces? I mean, I would imagine living with somebody, being married to someone like this could be really challenging because you really don't have that the peace and the predictability of that.
Yeah, and really that's really the last chapter of that last book is kind of knowing when you need to walk away. Um, it's not an inevitability. As I said before, many of these people get better. In fact, they all get almost all get certainly better. And depending on the commitment and the dedication, you can certainly make these things work over time. But I guess recognizing what you're dealing with and how to deal with it, and making sure that energy is worth it, is important. But you're right, it can be very difficult.
It can be very difficult. Wow. Is there a website or something that people can go to find a psychiatrist or psychotherapist who specializes in borderline personality disorder?
Yeah, I don't think there are a few therapists who say that anymore because they're afraid of getting flooded.
Okay. Okay. All right.
With that. So there are few people that I'm aware of anyway who want to say, oh yeah, that's my specialty. Send me over that. They don't want that. Which is why in my practice, I had a nice balance between people with BPD who were very gratifying as they got better over time, and people with ADHD who got better in a week or two.
Oh, wow.
with certain treatments, and having a balance. But there are many websites. I don't want to.
Right. So I know there's a lot of Psychology Today articles,
Yeah.
and so if you search, you could probably
Yeah,
probably find doctors.
And I do frequently get requests from that, and usually a good place to start. There are several, and they're in all of my books, references of places that usually treat their. Most are on the East Coast.
Okay.
The McLean in Cambridge has a specialized, especially for borderline women. Westchester, Cornell in New York has some specialty treatment. And there are several facilities, and I'll usually recommend contacting a local university or something. They can usually have people on faculty who at least have experience in that area and can make recommendations.
Okay, thank you. I think that's great, and I'm glad. So the other two books are I have it right here. I Hate You, Don't Leave Me, and Sometimes I Act Crazy. So these are all still available on Amazon.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
You're
I've learned a
welcome.
lot. I know my listeners have. This really clears a lot of the questions up, because if you look up, is this treatable? You're going to be like, no. So I think that's encouraging for people who are not only living with the disorder themselves, or people whose loved ones have it. So this is very encouraging, and I thank you so much for being my guest today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed being with you today, Randy.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. Have a great day. Take care.
You too.
Okay. Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Bye.